The smartest engineers I've known refuse to use AI. They get super excited by tough bugs, and they love to read code documentation. And here I am trying to optimize every step of my process, meet the next deadline, and there's still nothing I can do to keep up with them. I've realized that while I'm optimizing for productivity, they're optimizing for learning, and ironically, that ends up making them way faster in the long run. To explain why, I want to introduce a concept from neuroscience called a chunk. A chunk is a unit of processing information that you see as a single step when you're reasoning through a problem. So a beginner in chess would see the 32 pieces on the chessboard all as separate chunks, while someone who's more experienced might see the open Sicilian Najdorf variation and know all of the benefits and drawbacks that come to them in that position, just in that one unit of reasoning. There's a really cool study from the 70s that illustrates this concept. Researchers took a board from a real chess game and showed it to masters and beginners and asked them to reconstruct it. The masters were able to reconstruct 90% of the board, while beginners were only able to reconstruct 4 pieces. The interesting part is when the researchers ran the study a second time, randomly scattering the pieces on the board to create positions that would never arise in a real game, the masters' advantage completely disappeared. They weren't remembering the individual pieces, but they were remembering the chunks. And when the chunks weren't there, then neither was their advantage. This study showed what expertise actually is. And it's not faster thinking, but just bigger units of thought. And the only way to build these chunks is to spend time deeply understanding something as opposed to just executing. Okay, duh, so learning is good and it's important to spend time doing so. But when I hear this, I think that learning and output lie on the spectrum. And the more time you invest learning, the less time you can actually spend progressing towards your goal. And no one wants to turn in their work late. To see how this trade-off shakes out, I built a toy model. The numbers are made up, but the shape of the curve is what matters rather than the specific values. Imagine 2 people starting a new job at the same skill level, an outcome-oriented person and a learning-oriented person. The outcome-oriented person takes 16 hours to complete their task on average and picks up 3 new chunks, which are patterns that they can apply to their future tasks. The learning-oriented person is more focused on picking up chunks, so they pick up 5 chunks per task, but in exchange, they have to take 22 hours on average to complete their tasks. Each new chunk they pick up makes them 1% more efficient at future tasks, and each new task that they take on is 3% more complex because as they become more competent, they're given more complex tasks. As you can see on screen, I created an equation to model this situation, and even with these fairly conservative assumptions, the learning-oriented person catches up to the same per-task speed at around task 16, and catches up to the total amount of work completed by around task 33. At a normal working pace, that's about 2 months of feeling slower than you'd like, and from there, the gap keeps widening indefinitely. If you want to see the equation I used and play around with the parameters, I've linked it in the description below. Of course, there's going to be some tasks in your way that you're just going to have to grind out, and that might be the right call. But generally, the more time that you spend learning upfront, the bigger your advantage is, and the upfront cost is a lot smaller than you might expect. So how do you actually do this in practice? Here are some habits that I'm working on implementing myself, and all of them revolve around maximizing your chunks learned per task rather than your tasks completed per week. The first one is the hardest. You have to learn to not shortcut past confusion. When you don't understand something, there's a moment of friction where your brain wants to give up. For me, I'll often reach for AI. But this is the exact wrong thing to do because that means I'm skipping a step where a new chunk would have been formed. Lean into the discomfort because it's an important sign that something that will accelerate your progress in the long term is happening. Along the same lines, I think you should stop chasing flow. If you don't know, flow is that smooth and effortless feeling where you're cruising through your work, and a lot of productivity advice treats that as the goal. I think that's half wrong. The research on deliberate practice is fairly clear that real skill growth happens at the edge of your ability, where it feels effortful and a little frustrating. If your work feels too smooth, you're probably executing on chunks that you already have rather than building new ones, and you're missing out on the compounding effects of learning orientation in the long run. The third one is to contextualize while you solve. The next time a problem comes up, take 30 seconds to ask yourself how this problem came up, what you did to solve it, and whether you could apply it to a slightly different problem tomorrow. That's the step that turns a solved problem into a portable chunk and allows you to apply it to a new problem rather than forgetting about it next week. The last one is to change what you're measuring. If your internal scoreboard is tracking tasks completed, then you'll skip the chunk formation step every time because it takes time without contributing to your task completed at all. Instead, track chunks learned and focus on explaining the concepts that you couldn't explain yesterday. This will help you find the process of learning more inherently rewarding. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that my top performing colleagues were learning a lot because they inherently enjoyed it, and that I couldn't brainwash myself to do the same. But it turns out the research suggests that it's at least partly the other way around. People who enjoy learning do so because they've built up enough chunks to find things more inherently interesting. Self-determination theory, one of the more well-supported frameworks in motivation research, identifies competence as one of the main drivers of intrinsic motivation. As you get better at something, the activity becomes more rewarding. There's also a really nice idea from the psychologist George Lowenstein called the information gap theory of curiosity. Curiosity isn't a personality trait, but something that activates when you know just enough to see what you don't know. A chess beginner can't be curious about openings because they don't know what they are and they don't know that they could take them to the next level. As you build chunks, the gaps in your knowledge become more visible, and curiosity starts naturally driving more of your learning. So while you won't suddenly start loving the difficult process of learning, picking up these habits will help it become more frictionless over time. The important takeaway is that learning is crucial for your long-term trajectory, and the time that it takes to ramp up with your learning is much shorter than you might think. The reward will last for the rest of your career, and you'll probably develop a much better relationship with the work itself.